We're in Matthew still, chapter 23. You can open there if you're not there already. Matthew chapter 23. And sometimes as we get started and prepare to study Scripture together, I like to ask you a question, just get your mind going a little bit. So this morning, I want to ask, if you spent your whole life working hard, blood, sweat, tears, and never received any recognition at all, never received any awards, no medals of honor, or never earned any degrees, no one ever appreciated you, no one ever thanked you, no one ever praised you, would that bother you? Thank you, David. I always count on David for honesty. I mean, would you, if you knew that you would come to the end of your life and you would get zero recognition, I mean, would you keep going as tenaciously? Would you work as hard? Would you keep serving people if you knew they were never going to appreciate or thank you one bit for what you did? Right now, some of you are saying, that's the story of my life. Moms are probably thinking that right now. Yeah, welcome to a day in my life, right? I mean, does it matter at all? To all of us, it matters. It matters to varying degrees how much we are appreciated, how much we are honored. There's varying degrees to that. Some people are more intrinsically motivated. They do what they do because they love to do it. They're motivated by the pleasure of working on a goal or accomplishing things. That's very intrinsic, that motivation. Other people, there's like a spectrum. Other people on the other side where they're very extrinsically motivated. They do it only because of the praise and the accolades or the respect of people. And so there's a spectrum, but everybody, no matter where you fit on that spectrum and your personality type, the way you're wired, the experiences you had, whatever, wherever you fit on that spectrum, everyone in here wants some level of recognition, some level of respect, some level of honor. That is part of the human condition. Well, this morning we're going to continue our series we're calling Good News for Pharisees. We're in part 2. And in one sense, it's part 3 because we had an introduction. We spent 1 week just talking about who were the Pharisees, and we went into a lot of details. And then last week, we started walking through the passage. And this week, we're going to continue. We're going to be in verses 5 to 12. Continue on here as Jesus teaches about the Pharisees. And he, as usual, I mean, with laser focus, he just zeroes in on what was true about them at the heart level. He just pulls down the facade. He just opens up the chest and says, this is what is true on the inside when it comes to Pharisees. And as I've been saying throughout this whole series, we are all Pharisees. We are all Pharisees. To say I'm not a Pharisee is to be acting in a Pharisaical way. You are a Pharisee. I am a Pharisee. And so, because I've already covered in detail who they were historically and culturally and all that, let me just say, to summarize it this morning, what you need to understand, if you haven't been with us, what you need to understand about the Pharisees is they were really after the same thing everybody else in their world was after. They were set apart. They were separatists. They were religious people. They were known in that way. They were the best of the best in terms of observance of the law and their dedication to God and all of that. But really, they were after the same thing that everybody else in their world was after, and everybody else in our world is after today too, which is the good life, a little pleasure down here, a little satisfaction down here, and a little respect down here. That's what they were after. And they just happened to use the religious sphere in which to go after that. They found throughout their lives, the way they were wired, the way their minds work, maybe they were good, diligent students. They like to study texts and they like to break things down. That's the way they were wired. And so they found that in that sphere, they could really excel. And they did. And it works the same in our world today. They're all different career paths you can take and different skill sets and interests and all that. And those types of things take people all different directions in life. Well, they found that their best direction was this religious direction, and that's where they could best to use a psychological term, actualize themselves, become the best version of themselves they could be, to be the best you can be, right? Well, today, there is the same temptation. And it may be more seductive for people like me, admittedly, when this is my career path, than it is for you, but it is there for you too. This, as we've been seeing throughout here, this relates to authority in general, any position of authority. And all of us throughout our lives have some measure of authority. This is all about authority and abuse of authority. So let me just remind you, we won't look in detail, but just remind you we're looking at characteristics of the Pharisees, okay? We're looking at characteristics of their version of authority specifically. And last week, we looked at 3 of them. Let me just give you a little summary. The first one was assumed authority, and it says in verse 2 of chapter 23, that they seated themselves in the seat of Moses, which means they assumed a position of authority for themselves. And that word assumed is perfect because in one sense that means they took a position of leadership, but in another sense it also means they supposed something to be true without any evidence that it was true. And that's what they did. God had never appointed them. They created their own little system. There was no designation of Pharisees in the Old Testament. They invented their own little circle, their own little political party, so to speak. And they were sitting in authority, judging everybody around them. We said that's the human condition. We all have ways of doing that. We assume we know better than other people. We implicitly trust our own perspective. Even as we sit in judgment, and sometimes we assume what we know, or we assume we know what our wives were thinking, or what our husbands were thinking. Sometimes we build up, we boil with this frustration, fuming anger inside because we are just building up in our heads this perspective of what they are thinking or what they are feeling or what they intended by what they said or what they intended by what they did. In those moments, we are assuming this position of authority. We're assuming we see clearly. We are sitting in the seat of Moses, so to speak, as if we can look down and have the judgment of God or the lenses of God through which to judge people. When in reality, God says there is one judge. It is God alone. We don't see as clearly as he sees. So there's assumed authority. That's the first characteristic. The second was hypocritical authority. Jesus says they tell you to do things. And he says, go ahead and do and observe what they tell you to do and observe when it accords with what Moses taught. But he says they say things and do not do them. It's the old do as I say, not as I do line that we like to say to our kids. Do as I say, not as I do. They were hypocritical. And Jesus, we highlighted this last week, this amazing contrast where Jesus, he was never hypocritical, was he? There was no pretense with him. What you see is what you get with Jesus. He never taught anything that he didn't believe with his whole heart, and he never asked anyone to do anything or commanded anyone to do anything that he himself was not doing or would not in the future do. Even when he says to his disciples, take up your cross, follow me, they didn't even understand what that meant at that time. And Jesus went on, didn't he, to take up his cross, lay his life down. He was never hypocritical. Thirdly, it was burdening authority, and that's where we talked about verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens, lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move these burdens with so much as a finger. They won't even lift a finger. Constantly imposing their ways on other people. In this past week's study, I noticed something I hadn't realized before. A commentator brought out a point regarding this I thought was really helpful. He linked it to the human way that we all have of assuming that we know better, just naturally exalting our own opinion over others and even imposing on others that opinion. Or somehow believing that others should act according to the way we act. And here's what tends to happen. Remember I said earlier, the Pharisees, they found they fit in a certain segment of society. They were the bookworm types of people, so they kind of migrated over to that kind of career path, right? And they were good at that. And in that sphere, they created all these extra traditions and rituals. And for them, those traditions and those rituals were part of their everyday practice that fit right into their bookworm lives easily. But for other people who had other types of jobs, people who worked in agriculture and they had long, long days, for them to have to submit to all these extra traditions and rituals was very burdensome. And the Pharisees took joy in doing that because that was a way they could have something to hold over other people, to make themselves feel like they were superior. Meanwhile, guess what happened to the others? They were crushed under the weight of those burdens because they couldn't keep up. Once again, we all have ways of doing that sort of thing, of imposing our perspective or our lifestyle or the way we use our time. Well, why doesn't that family use their time the way our family uses our time? Or why doesn't my spouse want to use her time the way I like to use my time? And then we impose that. And for us, it fits and it's easy because it's the way we're wired. But for them, it's totally the opposite. And nevertheless, we impose it on them. We burden them and we even criticize them and accuse them in those areas. It's a Pharisaical way of doing things. It's kind of the way, it's easy for me. Why isn't that easy for you? It's this self-absorbed, self-centered view of the world, which says that everyone should think like me, act like me, have the same opinions I have, and if they did, everything would be great. Well, I mean, think about that. That's completely self-absorbed. And they used their religion, they even used the Bible, the Old Testament of their day, they used talk of God to exalt themselves and manipulate people. And there are countless ways by which we do the same thing today. So, there's a contrast. Jesus wasn't like that, was he? Jesus said in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you" what? Rest. He doesn't come to put burdens on people. He comes to take burdens off. He serves, comes alongside people to liberate people. He doesn't put chains on people. He takes the chains off. That's why he says in Galatians, "For freedom, Christ has set you free." And if we're not careful, we can use even our religious devotion, even our biblical beliefs, to try to control and oppress other people. And I would say it's not a matter of if we do it, it's when we do it, and we're all guilty of it. And the only solution is to see over and over and over again who Jesus is and how different he was, and to be caught up in worship of him because of how the benefit of who he was and what he was like is what rescued us, what saved us. So growing in that appreciation. And so this morning as we continue, we're going to look at one more characteristic of the Pharisaical version of authority here in verses 5 through 12. And really this one is one characteristic, but Jesus gives several examples of it. And it's what I call honor-loving authority, or we could call it respect-loving authority or attention-loving authority. It's everything in line with what we talked about as I opened the message this morning. Look at verse 5. It says, "But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men." Why do they do what they do? To be noticed by people. Then he goes on to give some examples. They broaden their phylacteries, lengthen the tassels of their garments. What in the world is a phylactery? Well, some of you might know that, but it's a little box really that is tied around the forehead and the left arm. And inside that little container would be a scroll, a miniature scroll with scripture on it. The Pharisees would wear them. In fact, today, still, Orthodox Jews will wear them during seasons of prayer. And you can look on the internet and you can see pictures of the little box right here and right here. And you think, well, that's, culturally to us, that's a strange kind of practice. But to them, it's something that's gone on for many, many hundreds of years. It goes back to the Old Testament where God says to his people in several different places, I want you to take my words. I want you to take the truth of who I am and my commands, and I want you to bind it to your hand or to your forehead. He literally says that in many different places. Well, they took that literally and literally created these little capsules or boxes and put them on their forehead and on their arm. But it seems as though that was not God's intent, really, that they would take it literally like that. It more had to do with, I want you to be mindful of who I am and what I'm telling you as you're thinking and as you're living your life. So the forehead representing, symbolizing thoughts. the left arm symbolizing activity, or the hand, sometimes it says bind it on your hand, symbolizes activity. And so God's saying, I want this to be ever present on your mind and on your heart and in your actions as you live your day-to-day life. And it's interesting. I looked at every passage, and there's probably 5 or 6 of them in which God uses that kind of language about the forehead and the arm or the hand. And in every one of them, the context is God reminding his people, I delivered you from Egypt. I delivered you from bondage. You were enslaved. You were oppressed. You were miserable. I rescued you. Don't forget me. Don't forget me. Don't forget what I've done for you. And then live according to what I've done for you. And at one point in Exodus, it's before they've even been released from Egypt, but God is telling him, here's what's going to happen. And he says, and I want you to have this feast of unleavened bread, and I want you to take this unleavened bread for 7 days, and I want you to eat it. And I want you to think about who I am and how I am your sustenance and I'm your provider. And then later in that same passage, he says, and you're going to have this Passover feast. There's going to be this remembrance in which you offer an animal, and it represents God passing over when he slaughters the firstborn of the Egyptians, and he passes over your people and he rescues you. I want you to remember. Don't forget. Have this on your forehead and on your hand. Have it with you all the time. Don't forget. So, a question. What was the point of it then? The point of it was that they might remember who? God. That the attention might be on God. And yet, what Jesus is exposing here is they took this practice, and guess where the spotlight was shining in the Pharisaical version of this practice? Was it on God? It wasn't, was it? It was on themselves. The phylacteries became a status symbol, a way to show, hey, look at how dedicated I am. Look at how I take the law more seriously than you. I mean, I've got it strapped to my body. Beat that one. My Bible's got more study notes than yours. They had the tassels, similar type of thing. God had said, hey, I want you to have tassels on your garments. Jesus had tassels on his garments when he walked around. But they were intended to be a reminder. And what they did was they made them more beautiful, and they broadened them, and they lengthened them, and they made all these things more obvious, more prominent. Look at me. And they were hijacking biblical truth, religion, to boost, to prop themselves up. Remember I said earlier, they were after the same thing everybody else was after, the good life, including a little honor, a little respect down here. And this was their approach. And as it says, verse 6, they love the place of honor at banquets, the chief seats in the synagogues. When someone would host a banquet in those days, there was a seat to the right of the host. And that was the honored seat. So if you were invited as a guest and you were invited to sit in that seat on the right of the host, that was the best seat in the house. That meant you were an important person. And guess what? They craved that position because of what it said about them and their worth and their value and how everyone respected them for being able to sit there. So they must have done something right to be able to sit there. In the chief seats in the synagogues, that was a place right up front. In our day, it's like the opposite in our churches. Nobody's sitting right up here. Everyone's like as far back as possible. But in their day, in a synagogue, people actually wanted to sit close to the opening of the law and the person who was teaching. And that was the honored seat. That's where the leaders sat. And they loved it. Verse 7, they loved respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. Being in the grocery store and someone saying, oh, hi, pastor. How are you? A reverend, whatever, right? Sort of modern day equivalent of that. And they loved it. Because that was their niche. It's just like any other sphere of life. You want to be honored for what you do. You want to have a career that's respectable. You want people to admire you. And in this circle, that's the way they rolled, man. That's how they did it. It makes perfect sense. And it's completely and entirely human. And Jesus is not here saying There's no place for respecting people. Clearly, the Bible in many places prescribes respect for people in authority. He's not saying there's no place for respect. He's talking about in the individual who is in that position, their love for it, their craving, the way of exalting themselves, their way of oppressing other people by means of this practice. That's what he's talking about. And so he gives some words of correction here, and we'll look at these in a second, in verse 8 and following. But for now, I struggle with this because I can think of 1,000 different examples in my life of how this applies. And I've shared several embarrassing examples, and I'll give you another one this morning. Where Don and I went to seminary, I remember the first year we were required to go to the graduation service. And being an astute observer, I noticed that there were certain men with this yellow cord going over their shoulder at the graduation. So they had their gown and cap on, and there's this yellow cord. And that, as the ceremony proceeded, I found out that the reason for that was those were the honors students. So those were the ones graduating with honors. And at that particular school, not only did they have a cord, but when they would go across the stage, and there would be, I don't know, I forget if it was 50 to 100 people that would be graduating at a time. And so when they would go across the stage, when their name was read, their GPA would be read also. And the MC of the event would always say, well, don't, basically hold your applause to the end, etc. So you weren't allowed to clap or anything. But whenever someone went across in 3.98, 3.97, or 4.0, they would be just like, wow. The crowd, wow. Don, do you remember this? You remember, right? Yeah, he missed every single graduation. Somehow, how'd you get out of that? One year they were living up here. But anyway, there's just like this amazement in the audience. And then here's what would happen. I mean, inevitably this would happen. So-and-so, 3.98. Oh, wow. When you hear this chatter. And then John Doe, Bob Smith, nothing, just silence. Everyone's like, what a loser, right? No numbers at the end of his day. So I remember determining, from that day forward, if it kills me, I will graduate with honors from this school. Doggone it, I did it. And it did almost kill me. The stress of having to ace every Hebrew exam. Just so that when Jeff Pierce is read, there's some numbers behind it, and it's not that awkward silence. And man, was it satisfying, let me tell you. Never satisfying. It would be, that example makes sense to you, right? But it would be a mistake to try to narrow this down to certain very specifics, because look, this is very broad. It has to do with motive. There's 1,000 different ways of doing this sort of thing. I remember years ago hearing a pastor teach this passage, and some really good things brought out. But at one point, I remember him saying, hey, look, in light of this, what is said about the Pharisees here, this is why I don't sit up on stage. This is why I don't insist people call me Dr. So-and-so. And this is why I don't wear robes when I preach. And I remember even at that time thinking, wait a minute, that sounds to me overly simple. It's actually not the point. There really is nothing evil in a little box tied to your forehead. It's real weird, but there's nothing evil about it. There's nothing sinful about that. It's the motive. It's why. Here's why. Because we love honor. We love respect. We want to look good. We want to be celebrated. We want to be admired. We want to be worshipped. And that's not applicable to only some of us. That's everybody sitting in here. So Jesus gives his corrective, and at the end, as I close, I want to read to you a passage that I think is the perfect contrast for this, that we see the glory of Christ. But before we get there, let's just look at what he says. Verse 8, he's teaching his disciples right now. He's not talking to the Pharisees at this moment. So he says to his disciples, hey, don't be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. So these terms of respect, rabbi, teacher, leader. He's like, look, they don't fit you. And he's not saying, I mean, he says father. He's not saying don't call your dad father. He's just saying don't crave those titles and use those titles as somehow some definition of your worth and a demarcation of superiority. Don't do that. And that happens out there in the world. That's the way the world works. But don't you dare take the things of God and do that. And I'll tell you, we do this all the time. He makes it very clear. Look, if you learn anything, and as much as this pains me to say it, it's not because of me. If you learn anything, if you walk away with anything that has opened your eyes more clearly to see Christ for who he is, that came from him. And his Spirit, he gets all the credit for it. And there's something within me and something within you that just doesn't like that. He says in Romans 11, Paul says, from him, through him, and to him are all things. To him belongs the glory. Period. So he says, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. Whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. How frustrated we get. We get ourselves all spun up when someone is exalted and we feel they don't deserve to be. And God has always made it clear, look, at some time, he's going to level everybody. He humbles those who exalt themselves. And he doesn't do it right away, but he will do it inevitably. And he will do it in all of our lives. I came across this proverb, Proverbs 25, 6 and 7. Do not claim honor in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of great men. For it is better that it be said to you, come up here, than for you to be placed lower in the presence. Do not claim honor in the presence of the king, and don't stand in the place of great men. God gives grace to the humble. Resist the proud, gives grace to the humble. The appropriate response is say, I don't belong. I don't even belong in the building, let alone in the chief seats. And God says to us, you get to sit at the king's table. You get to sit at the king's table. You, me. And it's all a gift. God does say, come up here. He does give us that gift. So I want to read with you Isaiah 53. Turn to Isaiah 53 and we'll close on this note. This is the great contrast between the ways of men and the ways of Christ. And I believe as we admitted that, hey, this relates to all of us. We're all like this to one degree or another. There is no way to save ourselves from this problem. There's no way to fix this problem. And God doesn't even expect for us to fix this problem, but to admit it, to acknowledge it. And the remedy is to see Christ, to see the opposite of who Christ is. And so I want to read to you Isaiah 53, and I just want you to think through this carefully and just envision Christ and his great humility in your mind as I read it. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with rich men in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. Let's pray. God, thank you for your word and the contrast between Christ and us, and how Christ is our rescuer, our deliverer. God, I pray that we would be more and more sensitive to our own Pharisaical ways. And as we see the contrast between how Pharisaical we can be, how prideful and arrogant we can be, how we can use religion to exalt ourselves and to oppress other people, that as we see that more clearly, that we would, along with that we would see the beauty and the glory of Christ and his humility and his sacrifice and his selflessness. God, that would more and more win our worship and liberate us from the misery and the burden and the bondage of self-centered living, and that it would spill over with divine enablement to be able to serve the people around us. So thank you, God, for your truth this morning. Thank you for the ways that it has opened our eyes, and pray that this would continue. And we commit ourselves and even our communion service to you in Jesus' name.